Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another duet review here at Cup of Hemlock. This time, we're revisiting Anatevka, but to discuss the film version specifically, and its director, the wonderful Canadian from Toronto, Norman Jewison. Not a Jew. He is a goy.
Yeah, it comes up a lot.
It does. And so this documentary is called Fiddler's Journey to the Big Screen, directed by Oscar-nominated director Daniel Raim. And joining me on this journey back to Anatevka after our whirlwind experience the first time around, it is the wonderful Mr. Raim Borochovitz.
Hello, Mac. Good to be here. Glad you didn't do the full Tevye introduction like last time. I think you made the right call. It was fun the first time. I was all ready to roll my eyes at it again, but good to just do the hello and
Ryan, you know one of my dream roles is to play Tevye.
I do, and we'll talk about in this episode whether or not it's appropriate for you to do so, maybe.
We'll get into it. But Ryan, what is in your cup today? And I must see you looking very festive in your sweater.
Yeah, thanks. It was actually said, just for some context, we're filming this March 1st of 2022, having just seen this documentary presented in the Toronto Jewish Film Festival. But it's also going to have releases at other festivals in New York and LA, closer to probably when we do release this episode. And then I believe they said that the Blu-ray and DVD release wouldn't happen until around Hanukkah. So I guess this is kind of a Hanukkah-y, ugly Christmas sweater type vibe. There's no menorahs on it. It's not specifically, but
Love it.
Yeah, I thought that seemed appropriate. And I wore a sweater in our last Fiddler. So maybe if we continue doing episodes on documentaries about Fiddler, because there are more to plumb the depths of, maybe that'll be an ensemble theme, as you like to say. And
you'll be very proud.
And in my cup, I'm actually drinking coffee right now. Ooh, in the cup. There you go. Look at that.
Love it. And today I am drinking another wonderful glass of tangerine grapefruit Crystal Light. My favorite flavor.
Good choice.
Yes, thank you. All right, Ryan. So yes, we just watched this over the weekend. It just premiered in Canada at the Jewish Film Festival. And we actually had the privilege of being in a Zoom Q&A with the director Daniel, as well as the Fiddler Films Shtetl, Ms. Rosalind Harris, who was superb.
Yes,
any people who are working on the Fiddler remake coming up, I highly recommend you pull a Rita Moreno and West Side and cast Ms. Harris as Yenta the Matchmaker.
And if you do take that suggestion now, you owe Mac some kind of finder's fee for suggesting it.
Exactly. Cast me as one of the Anatevka people. I'll happily come on board.
Sure.
Yes. Either way. All right, Ryan. Well, let's get into this documentary.
Yeah,
so first off, what are your overall thoughts on this documentary? Do you feel it tells the production history of the film well, as this film was touted as the Fiddler's journey to the big screen? So you're coming in expecting it to be how the film got from point A to point B. So do you feel it conquered its goal? Did this documentary live up to its title?
I think it did. It tells the story very well. I just, in general, as an overall appraisal, I liked it a lot. It really did a good job of telling exactly the story it wanted to tell. And something that Daniel said in the Q&A that I thought was worth mentioning is that he doesn't feel like what he did here and what he was trying to do here is to tell necessarily the exhaustive or comprehensive or definitive version of how this film got made, this film being Fiddler on the Roof, not the documentary itself, because think about that in circles if you can. But he had a very kind of specific vision of the story that could be told within it. I would argue, and we'll get more into this in a future question, that focusing on Jewison as this protagonist figure gave it this sort of narrative shape and through line that, but it knows what it's doing and it understood that that's the story it's telling. And in that, I think it was very good and very efficient. And yeah, I'm not complaining about that by any means. And in general, it was really good. And I thought there was actually a lot of interesting filmmaking stuff, just in documentary filmmaking on display here that I imagine we'll have occasion to talk about in some future questions. So we might not need to get into more detail about that here. But overall, very good documentary. I was happy with it.
Yeah. For me, I also agree. Like, I thought this documentary was superb. Like, when I saw the original trailer, I immediately tagged Ryan being like, follow up?
Yep.
Question mark. And so I was really excited. And when I saw it was coming out this weekend, I knew it was like, Ryan, now is the time. Break out the fiddles. So we jumped right into it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I watched it actually twice before we did the Q&A, and the Q&A was superbly well done, very well moderated. And so, yeah, I think once again, it's telling the production history from the Norman Jewison perspective, and more about what his experience is as someone who is not Jewish, but certainly has close connections and feels very strongly and passionately about the Jewish faith, comes in and takes on this piece, and then what's the fallout of tackling this piece afterwards. And I mean, they did a really good job of editing around and really kind of keeping it honed in on Jewison and his experience bringing this very popular musical to the big screen. So everything regarding the cast, because Jewison does mention how there are deleted interviews he did where some of the actresses who play the daughters talk about Molly Pecan more, who played Yenta, or the actress who played Golda, or the actor who played Motel. There's more of those cut cast reminiscences about fellow cast members that just didn't quite fit the overall edit of the film, which shows that this Daniel knew what he was doing, in the sense of he knew what the story was, Norman Jewison and his relation with Fiddler, in Judaism in general. So it was very well done. So yeah, I think they told a very concise, and as Ryan said, this isn't and as Daniel said, this isn't the definitive Lord of the Rings extended edition 3-hour documentary extravaganza about the making of this film. Even though I would totally watch a 3-hour behind the scenes documentary about the making.
I would, and I hope we get more Fiddler documentaries. I don't think there's ever like a ceiling of, okay, we've said everything there is to say about Fiddler. We saw a very good one that we'll talk more about in a minute about the Broadway production. This was a very good one about the film, but there's always more to unpack.
You could do a whole documentary about Topol and his experiences doing Fiddler, because I mean, he's done the role all basically up until 2009 is when he finally stepped away at like in his mid 70s. And as I told in our deleted scene in our last Fiddler episode, was I was supposed to see him in that bloody tour, and he blew his shoulder out in Buffalo.
But that wasn't deleted. That made it into the episode, didn't it?
Did it make it in?
Yeah, you talk about how you saw Harvey Fierstein instead. But,
right. Yes.
Yeah.
If I were a rich man.
Yeah, exactly. But no,
don't bring him back for the remake.
No,
go for an Alfred Molina, Mandy Patinkin, not Harvey Fierstein, please.
we love you, Harvey. But if you're watching, but it's funny that you mentioned like Topol's perspective as a possible, like if we were to see another documentary about the making of Fiddler, his would be interesting, because something that Daniel said in the Q&A is that, and Daniel, if I'm misquoting you, get in the comments and please tell me otherwise, that the series of interviews that eventually became this film, Topol was actually, if not the first one of the first ones before he'd even interviewed Jewison. Mm-hmm. So I kind of think it's interesting that Daniel was accumulating all of this interesting material about Fiddler, about the film, thinking of, okay, not really sure what he was going to do with it, and then interviewing Jewison seemed to kind of click into place. This is the story that needs to be told. Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's dive a little bit deeper into the documentary. So the documentary opens with the scene of Tevye and the butcher, Laser Wolf, having an argument at the wedding of following the gifting of the gifts, which Laser Wolf gave was 5 chickens for the first 5 Sabbaths. And Topol and Tevye and Laser Wolf get into it. It's a great, funny scene.
You can keep your diseased chickens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You will leave my chickens out of this. With me, a bargain is a bargain. The terms weren't settled.
Yep. Great scene.
Yes, it is. But why do you think Daniel chose to open the documentary this way? Because it starts with that scene and then it pans out to show the behind the scenes footage of Jewison directing this particular confrontation at this big ensemble wedding moment. Do you think there was a better clip that could have opened this documentary? Because we see clips throughout of, like, If I Were a Rich Man, Matchmaker, more Anatevka. There's shots throughout from the film. So why do you think he opened with this particular argument, and what do you think Do you think it worked, or do you think you would have rather it opened on a different particular sequence from the film?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Ooh.
I don't want to say it worked or it didn't work, but I just found it was curious, and that's why I kind of did want to make sure we address this on some
Mhm.
level, because to me, I think the reason, or the main reason why I could think of for why this clip was chosen, and this was also again talked about in the Q&A, we're going to talk about this Q&A a lot, I guess, is but that they had access to the National Film Board of Canada,
Mhm.
had sent a film crew to follow Jewison just as a Canadian
Yeah.
filmmaker working in Yugoslavia on this production, that the National Film Board of Canada sent this like documentary crew to do that, and they made this short documentary film about that. So having access to that footage is where we get a lot of this behind the scenes material that we do see in this new documentary.
Mhm.
So what I like about that scene in particular, not even specifically the fact that it's the scene at the wedding with this argument, but the footage that we saw was good, that we start in a scene that we've all seen the movie, we know it well, and then the camera pans and we see Jewison behind the camera.
Mhm.
And it's kind of is showing this, okay, we're peeling back the layer of this is the making of, and you get to see our central character and one of our main side characters being Topol, all in relation to each other in this making of process. Now, I do wonder, having not seen that National Film Board of Canada film, I do wonder if there were other scenes in it that could have served that same function of just pan the camera, show Jewison making the
Mhm.
movie. Because when the movie began, the documentary began, and this is the first scene we're introduced to, I had a sense of like ominous foreshadowing watching it, which
Mm.
I thought was interesting, because I thought that it was a very kind of deliberate editing choice or storytelling choice that was trying to telecast something about possibly arguments or inter-community disagreements or
Mhm.
broken arrangements. And I thought, oh, maybe it was a fraught production of making the film Fiddler on the Roof, and maybe that's what this documentary is going to be showing us. So
Right.
isn't this an interesting choice of scene to bring us into that?
Mhm.
And then that wasn't the case. It seemed like it was a fairly smooth production making the film. It's
Mhm.
still an interesting story worth telling, but that foreshadowing didn't seem to pay off, if it was even intended as foreshadowing, which I doubt now that it was. And that's okay. I'm not saying it has to be that. But it does make me think about, well, why of all the scenes is this the one that they chose? And I started trying to mull over in my head, especially since we decided that this is something we were going to talk about on this episode. Well, what scene might I replace it with? Just thinking, even if they don't
Mhm.
have that behind the scenes footage, I thought, well, maybe they could just start with something as simple as the opening of the movie Fiddler on the Roof and use that as like just a
Yeah.
good starting image, or maybe something somber like Anatevka at the very end of the
Mhm.
film, like that's just or maybe even something as like iconic as just If I Were a Rich Man, because that's an image that a lot of people have in their head when they think about Fiddler.
Absolutely.
But as I thought about it more, there were two possible scenes that actually came to my mind that would have been more appropriate, not just
Oh.
because they have this iconic imagery, but because they would do the work of that foreshadowing that I thought we were in store for with that first
Mhm.
scene, but actually pay off in relation to what the themes of this documentary actually turned out to be.
Right.
And so there's two that came to mind. They aren't necessarily both concrete scenes, but I'll just talk about them both, and then it's basically the same reason for why both. So I'll explain that in a second. The first scene is Tevye telling the constable, "If only you were a Jew." The,
Mm.
the second one, it's not, this one's not as concrete a scene, but something with Fedka. Fiedka? I can never pronounce
Fiedka.
that character's name.
Fiedka.
Fiedka. Or if not a scene with Fiedka, at least the scene of Tevye and Chava talking about Fiedka. A fish and a bird,
Yes.
or whatever. Yeah,
A bird may love a fish, but where will they make a
yeah.
home?
So, and the reason why
Which Topol gets into later on in the documentary about how he
yes.
purposely kills the joke.
Yeah. But like what I think is interesting about these two moments that I've highlighted here is because they are both instances in Fiddler on the Roof, the movie, where we are questioning the value of a character being not Jewish.
Mm.
And that is essentially the story that this documentary is telling. It is saying
Yeah.
Norman Jewison was a goyish man who had a very funny, perhaps nominative determinism in his name, that his name just happened to be Jewison. And it's asking, does it matter that he wasn't? Did it make him any more or less equipped to tell the story? And the film comes very clearly on the side of it doesn't matter, and we'll have our own discussion about that in a minute. But I think these moments that I've highlighted here, where, you know, if the constable was Jewish, would things have been different? Well, he certainly wouldn't be in that position to be the constable, but would he be able to sympathize and fight for the community in a different way? And this whole question with Fiedka and Chava at the very, like, you know, the climax of the story essentially is this is the last daughter, and it's the one move that Tevye will bend but not break on. And we talked about this in the previous episode in Fiddler, but, you know, this documentary is making a counter argument to what Tevye does there, that it kind of doesn't matter if this person is Jewish. He's willing to be part of this community, like if he's willing to marry into it. And I think if that doesn't feel like a good metaphor for Jewison making this film, I don't know what is. And maybe that, in my mind, might have been a more compelling, like rhetorically speaking, way of starting this documentary. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts of your own?
I mean, for me, I mean, it's a fun. I mean, that's, you know, the wedding argument always gives me a good chuckle. It's because it's
fun. I like it a lot.
Old men just bickering with each other. I mean, for me, it also just once it pans out, just shows how good Norman Jewison was at engaging with the whole cast. Like, it's seen behind the screen, cueing everybody, getting everybody kind of building the momentum of the scene. Like, you can see he's a very active director. So I think that's a good clip that kind of shows that. They also mention how this was a small documentary. So it wasn't like Lord of the Rings, where they had like hours upon hours of extended feature behind the scenes footage of them making the armor and stuff like that. I mean, that wasn't done in the 70s. That wasn't anything. And musicals were a dying film format at the time. So it wasn't like they were investing a lot of money into it. I mean, now we get more retrospective documentaries about the making of something versus on-set recording things. So I also question and go, was this just one of the shots they had that wasn't used in other parts of the film? So because that, they're like, great, we'll use the limited footage we have here. I do like your idea, though, using the opening. But what I would have done is, because I used the storyboards throughout, is it would have been great to see like the scene transition from storyboards into the actual film. And maybe if there is, by chance, any footage of Norman Jewison filming some of the opening sequence somewhere, then maybe use that, just because it is the opening scene and it's showing the transition from storyboarding to the finalized version of the film. So you could have gone the whole journey to the big screen within, or even start with, because they show clips of tradition with Topol in it from London, archival footage of that, and like show some of that to then the storyboard to the film to then the final film version as almost like a three-way transition shot.
Yeah, I like that. That
something you could have done. But once again, like, I think it was more just, what do we have available? How do we show Norman Jewison as a director working the scene? I definitely love your idea of doing the constable scene after that scene's always heartbreaking because it comes right after L'chaim, right? Where all of a sudden the Russians and the other villagers of Anatevka come together in the bar. There was a potential for a brawl to break out when they drunkenly bump Tevye, and then it becomes a dance, and then it's this big community celebration moment. And the next scene is, I like you. I wish you were a Jew. There's going to be a pogrom. Yeah. And just the anvil fall of that moment is so heartbreaking, so well done. So, I mean, that's a scene that I think often gets overlooked. So I think it would have been a really good scene to start with as well. I think that's a good choice.
See, the more I'm thinking about it, though, I'm gonna disagree with myself now, because I actually think, while I get rhetorically what that scene would be doing in relation to the themes, because it poses such a opposite conclusion to what this documentary does. Because yes, Tevye wishes that the constable was a Jew, but I'm not, and I'm also gonna ransack your village and then kick you out in a few weeks, or months, or however long the story takes. But
months. We see the seasons.
Yes, we do.
So
I don't know if that thematically does the same thing that I was kind of working through in my head. I think you have
to just take the small part of the conversation of, it's too bad you're not a Jew, and then Tevye kind of reiterating that point of, It's too bad you're not a Jew. And then
Yeah.
you don't get into the pogrom mischief part. Well, yeah, he doesn't call it a pogrom. He calls it a mischief.
Yeah.
Um,
Make
in the
mischief.
village.
A
Yeah, make mischief.
demonstration or
A
if he uses it,
demonstration.
yeah.
That's it. A demonstration.
Yeah.
So I mean that right there is. I mean that I think that yeah, you definitely wouldn't want that scene on because like the opening clip, it's only very short because then it pans out into the
Yeah.
into the wider shot, which is the behind the scenes look where the scene continues, but now it's from a different perspective, which once again is telling that story of you saw this version, you know this scene, but what you didn't realize was behind the scenes is Norman Jewison was like pointing at people and building and getting their energy up to respond.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting choice when you pose the question of about this opening. I hadn't thought about it, so I had to go back and go, oh yeah, like that is an interesting
Yeah.
observation. It is a choice. Like when you're directing something, you make a choice of what are you going to show. Like it's not just some random thing of let's just throw this scene on. There's a deliberate directorial choice as any good director choosing a shot. It's why.
And it only occurred to me as a question because I had that expectation of, this is foreshadowing for something that then wasn't paid off by the end of the movie.
It's too bad we didn't ask Daniel this in the Q&A on Sunday.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, but I'm like, nah. No, I didn't want it. I honestly didn't want to get a definitive answer on it. Yeah. I wanted to kind of allow myself to think through it as a receiver, but
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. All right, next question. Are we ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So, how does this documentary compare with the previous documentary of Fiddler on the Roof we covered, which was Fiddler, A Miracle of Miracles?
Yes.
Is this a good companion piece? Could you see this in a 2-disc DVD set sold at your local Walmart?
Yeah. Well, speaking of things that we could have and maybe did ask Daniel during the Q&A, I did pose this question to him. Well, not precisely this question, but I was curious. I was curious if he had seen this quite recent 2019 documentary, but I would have been very surprised if he hadn't seen it while he's working on his own Fiddler on the Roof documentary. But I asked, had he seen it? And if so, if he had any thoughts on the dialogue that the two did with each other. Because I think it's kind of indisputable that they work as companion pieces. Like they're both documentaries
one
about
picks
Fiddler.
Up where the other one leaves off, right? I mean,
and even if they didn't, even if there was like a lot of overlap between them, I still think a companion's a companion is a companion. Like it's... They're different films. They will obviously have different information, different details, different, focuses in their storytelling. So yeah, it seems pretty, self-evident that they would be companions. But what I liked about Daniel's answer to the question that I posed him is that he said, yes, of course he did see the film, and watching it kind of did force him to reflect on, okay, but what is the story I'm telling? That ground has all been covered. So, and I think it's probably that has a lot to do with the very focused character-centric story that we're given here, because it is also, he could have made that very definitive, this is the story of the making of the film, and that still would have been different from Miracle of Miracles, because that was about the Broadway show, and this is about the film. And in addition to being about the Broadway show, that's also just about the legacy and longevity and cultural universality. But yeah, I think by focusing on the film and really focusing on Jewison as this protagonist, we got a very different perspective that couldn't have been featured very prominently in a documentary that was about the stage show. Jewison does appear in that documentary, and they share the same anecdote of him talking to the executives who offered him to direct the film. He's like, I'm a goy, right? Like that was like the most overlap we got between the two, but how could you not include that in one that is just about the documentary? You also have to realize that even if they are companions, and we certainly treated them as such by watching one and then watching the other in fairly short succession, most people, well, maybe not most people, but a lot of people will only see one. Yes. Not everybody's seeking out all of the Fiddler documentaries like we've made. Might be.
I am shocked.
But I think Daniel is smart in the sense that he wasn't just making this movie for people who already saw that other one. Yeah. He made a point of not retreading all the same ground, because then why even bother making your own movie? Yeah. Just direct people to that one. Yeah. But this movie does, while still being a good companion to that, isn't reducible to being a companion to that, and it does stand on its own very well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was so pleasantly surprised when this documentary showed up as as like a Facebook suggestion of a group you may like. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, all right, let's take a look and check her out. But yeah, I mean, compared to Fiddler, I mean, it does get into the film, but it gets into the film in the sense of how did it how did the film overly impact the musical's legacy?
Mhm.
Because as we know, as Topol says in both documentaries, which is this was seen by over 6 billion people, or
Yeah.
however big the big number, whatever it is, and he goes, they all couldn't be Jewish.
Mhm.
So clearly, so clearly, and he talks about how the fact like it had a big release in Japan and things like that.
Yeah.
So
And Rosalind said in the Q&A
mhm,
too that like there are a lot of people who only know Fiddler from the movie,
film, yeah,
which like, and I think
mhm,
that's reason alone why it's worth telling this story divorced
agreed,
from the fact that
mhm,
this very important keyword in the title, this journey
yeah,
to the big screen,
mhm,
obviously the stage show is part of that journey.
yeah,
And but they do have different legacies and different engagements and mean
they
different
do,
things for different
mhm,
peoples. And I think this
yeah,
film does a good job of
mhm.
unpacking just this one narrow sliver of, okay, how do they make the film and what does it mean that the film was made?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because yeah, there are different. There are surprisingly some small differences between the film and the stage. Like in the film, you wouldn't know that Fietka has a song in Act Two.
Yeah.
That he like Model gets his own engagement song. There's a whole other song for Yenta to sing in the village. Um, so like there's extra little bits and pieces that just that aren't in the film, that which is fine. It totally works on its own. I mean, there's also added things for the film that were not on stage, like the extension of the pogrom, Golda going to see the Russian Orthodox priest to find out about the wedding. There's all that type of stuff there. So that's the nice thing, is that when you discover one, as Rosalind says, and hopefully it leads you to discovering
Yeah.
the other,
Now,
which would be the hope, which I assume is actually a lot of cases where people know the Fiddler film first, and then it's coming to my local theater, or my community's putting it on. Maybe I should go check it out because I like the
yeah.
movie,
Mhm.
or like I know the music because of the film. Funny, the same thing happened with West Side Story. West Side Story wasn't a big hit until the movie came along in '61, and then that really kind of skyrocketed the stage show
Yeah.
up the ladder. Same thing with Sound of Music. Sound of Music was big, but it wasn't until Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer did it that it became this worldwide phenomenon. So once again, it works as a good companion piece where they're passing batons to each other, where there are similar stories, but at the same time, like in the one, like in Miracle Miracles, Topol talks about how when he recorded "If I Were a Rich Man," he had a toothache.
Mhm.
In this one, they get into more about, well, how was that song, or how was that song created and
Yeah.
filmed first on film? What was the process of getting Topol
Stepping
up
on
the
the ladder.
ladder musically, or him at the end? Like, where does he look to find God? Like all those little things where it's like that works in this documentary because it's about the film, versus Miracle Miracles, where it's more about Topol and his experiences as Tevye, and how that legacy and how that's affected him down the road. They're coming at the story, but from two different angles, which is neat, and that's what makes this such a bigger, more comprehensive. Which I would love to see a 2 disc set of this thing released, because they really do work together. And I would encourage everybody to go watch one and the other, because
Yeah.
you'll come out very enriched by it.
And can we also just talk about Jeff Goldblum narrates it? Like
That's
that's something
true.
that this one has that the other doesn't.
It's funny. When I watched it the first time, I had totally forgotten Jeff Goldblum narrated,
Mhm.
and I didn't really pick up on his narration because there's not a ton of it,
Yeah,
and it's
not a
very
ton of it, and it's
subtle.
subtle. And he, as much as he does have a distinctive voice,
He
it's not.
doesn't really though.
Yeah, it's not
Yes.
like if James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman were narrating it,
Yes.
you couldn't miss that. Like, I agree. I knew ahead of time that he was narrating it, but I kind of, it wasn't until a few narration segments in that I kind of remembered. Oh, right,
Yeah.
that is Jeff Goldblum.
That's what's nice about watching it the second time, was that
Mhm.
I could actually find the Jeff Goldblum narration, because I came out of that first one going, "Where was he in that? I don't remember much of his narration at all."
Yeah,
Because
it
when
definitely.
yeah, because he's not doing his Jeff Goldblum isms, because he has his isms, but he's definitely not like, this is a very just straight him
Yeah, this
speaking.
isn't Dr. Ian Malcolm. This isn't The
No,
Fly. This is a very
no,
much I was tasked with just filling in these parts that they needed
Yeah.
narration for, which on one hand, I'd say it's maybe a bit of a shame that they have this great resource that may have been underutilized, but it also might have been a bit of a mercantile constraint of, okay, we have him in a sound studio for like maybe one day top, so let's just get these individual lines. I also don't necessarily know, this would have been another good question to ask in the Q&A, how at what point in the process, because they did talk about him in the Q&A a bit, but what point in the process did they know they had him? Because like maybe they recorded all these lines before they even knew the entire through line. Maybe he recorded a bunch of stuff that just didn't fit the story anymore, so they cut it out. So
maybe.
Maybe.
All right, well, let's get into the next question, which is Norman Jewison has notably stated that he is a goy. How do you think his experiences of being outside the Jewish faith, yet wanting to be part of it, influenced his direction in Fiddler?
So this, to me, is the big point of the whole documentary. We've talked about this already. We've circled around it. We kept saying we'll come back to it like in more detail, and this is the place.
This is it.
And we did already kind of litigate this a bit in the previous episode, or we had more of a conversation about does a Jewish actor have to play Tevye or have to play like the main roles in this show in general. But the directing like position is like an interesting one, and the film about the making of the film. The documentary is, I think, very clear in its stance that it is perfectly all right that we don't have to think cultural appropriation. How dare this goyish guy do this? But it very deliberately isn't necessarily making the argument that anyone can make anything and it's fine. It's saying this one guy in particular was very well suited for this material. And, we see all these scenes in it about how growing up, even though he wasn't Jewish, he faced anti-Semitism just because people assumed he was Jewish just based on his name. And so he has that experience in his biography. And he got married under a chuppah, for God's sake. And that
his second wedding.
And like the fact that he is not genetically Jewish, and by the standards of religious conversion, he might not even be like actually like Jewish, because you can also convert to Judaism, which it doesn't seem like he's ever done. But like he is clearly exposed to this culture, knows it well, has a great respect for it, and I loved the line that was in the documentary of for as long as I could remember, I always wanted to be a Jew. Very Goodfellas-esque, that. But yeah, it's, to me, the argument being made here isn't that anyone can do Fiddler, is that this one goyish person is the best suited for it. And there was also all the stuff like about his commitment to civil rights, his collaborations with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and like the documentary seemed very intent on flexing his allyship credentials, and like not just for Judaism, but for just his very progressive stance on many things. That this movie was made a long time ago, Fiddler on the Roof, this movie being, but it's good to know that he was kind of on the right side of history with a lot of these things when a lot of people from that era weren't. Which is why there's one little moment in the documentary in particular that I felt like they brushed over a little too quickly, as if it was charming, where the daughters were all reflecting on how they were eating all this delicious food that craft services had prepared for them, and they were starting to gain a little weight, and Jewison told them, that's it, you're gaining too much weight. They had to shut down production for a week so that the ladies can slim down again. And like, not great. I understand on a pragmatic level that you're making a film, there is continuity as a factor, that they do kind of need to look consistent throughout, but
they're also in a starving village. Yes,
I get that, but it's not cool to fat shame your female collaborators, I guess, is my... And
I don't know. I mean,
to shut down production on those grounds. That was the one kind of, because this documentary essentially treats Jewison as this like messiah figure, the perfect, ideal protagonist, not just for this story of the making of, but the ideal person too. If ever there was a goy that could direct Fiddler, it's him. And like the fact that the final moments of this documentary are him accepting his honorary Oscar in 1999, and the last line of the film is "not bad for a goy," he says in his acceptance speech. Like, that is the narrative we're going through here. But yeah, so because we're kind of putting him on this very high pedestal, I think it's okay to critique things from his, like we talked a lot about Jerome Robbins in the previous version, and yeah, he's praised in his own time, still praised to this day by a lot of the people who were interviewed in that documentary, including the late Stephen Sondheim, who was still alive when we recorded our episode of it and has since passed. But yeah, we can recognize that there are, nobody's perfect, and there are things that could have been done differently. Is why I bring up that point in particular.
It's true. Well, I mean, yeah, but for me, yeah, exactly. I mean, that story about him shutting down the production for a week. I don't know if he shut it down and just for the actresses and then did other things with Topol and Norma Crane or Molly Pecan or Laser Wolf. Not quite sure. I've never read the production schedule. But I go, as a director, I can see why he would do it. Clearly, if your director's noticing something and it's now becoming a continuity concern, then maybe you do kind of have to put your foot down and go, we got to shut it down. And I'm sure he did it in the nicest way possible. I'm sure he wasn't a dick about it, where it's like, you're fat, we're shutting you down. It's more just, the image is off. You're looking too well fit to be starving in the Ukraine right now.
And it's funny that they don't make that argument in the documentary, as to kind of like explain why. Like, I actually didn't even consider that. Like, yes, they are very poor in this village. That is a reason. Like, the continuity was the main thing that I was thinking of. I don't know if you watched El Camino, the like Breaking Bad Jesse spinoff movie that came out recently. It wasn't very good, don't bother. But Jesse Plemons, who plays Todd in Breaking Bad, appears in flashback scenes to stuff that was going on in Breaking Bad, and he's gained a lot of weight since then, and it kind of, momentarily took me out of it. That, like, wow, this is supposed to be taking place concurrent with all that other stuff, but you're clearly a lot heavier now. And like, it took me out of it for 2 seconds, but then I got over it. I'm like, okay, yes, this is made at a different time. It's on now I get that that's a different standalone film that's set in the same world and in the same time, so whereas continuity within the making of a single film itself might be a bit more of a tricky issue.
I guess it would be. I mean, I mean, like, I think back to when I mean, it's always tricky when you're working with children or with with things like that, where it's just getting continuity right. I mean, I look at like Sweeney Todd, for example. When you watch that film, the actor who plays Tobias starts off really little, and the end he's almost above Helen Bonham Carter's shoulder, and it's off that Helen Bonham Carter's pregnant throughout the filming of that film. So you see her changing in size throughout the film, and such. I mean, they tried to hide it as best as they could. It was one of the things you can't really shut down production for. This, where it's like, hey, shut down for a week, let's get you back down to fighting shape and size, and we'll pick right back up. I thought it was more funny about the fact he made them go shave their armpits.
Well, yeah, that also, I guess, is another one that I kind of forgot about until now. But yeah, like, to get to the kind of meat of the original question,
right?
Of, is it okay for him? Yeah, the film makes that very clear in the anecdote, the same one that we did hear relayed, where the producer Arthur Krim talking to him about, we want you to direct it. What if I told you I was a goy? And he paused, and I wrote down the quote, which I don't recall being in the other film, but I could be wrong.
It wasn't. It was a different quote.
Yeah, the Arthur Krim, the producer, said, again quoted by Jewison many years later, but what does that matter? We don't want a Second Avenue Yiddish production. We want a film for everybody.
Yeah.
And I take a little issue with that, actually, because I get that this is speaking to the theme of the previous documentary of this big idea of universality, and that I don't love the implication that you need a non-Jewish director to make that happen, that if you had a Jewish director, then it would just be also like kind of offensive to Second Avenue Yiddish productions, because like
there's a really good Yiddish production of Fiddler that just happened.
Exactly. And I think it's a little dismissive of, if you hire a Jew, he's just going to make the Jewish story. Whereas, like, I think we've talked at length about how there is a lot of universalism in the Broadway show that this is based on, with a mostly Jewish creative team, except for Hal Prince. But so why would having a Jew direct it be any different? And And I think, the fact that we've gone over that Jewison was so entrenched in this community and so in love with it, and really does kind of share these experiences specifically because of his perceived Jewishness. I don't know if that's a fair critique, even if I get the kind of very charming point they're trying to make about it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, my big thing is what made Norman Jewison a good choice for this is he understood the concept of othering. And that is big in this, whether it's Fietka and Hava, and the whole bird may love a fish, but it's othering, right? Like we have their circle, they have our circle. Like it's that division. And I mean, Norman Jewison throughout his whole life has been exploring otherness in the sense of the fact that his last name is Jewison, but he wasn't Jewish. He goes to the synagogue and gets turned away by the rabbi, or not the rabbi, it's by the Hebrew teacher, who I guess would be the rabbi. But either way, so he was turned away there. So then he goes into the war, comes out of the war, goes down into the States. He goes and sits at the back of the bus, something he doesn't even think twice about. He gets othered for that by the white people on the bus because he made a choice to sit somewhere that he didn't even care to sit. He was just like, I want a seat, I'm sitting here. And he gets off the bus. Then he does In the Heat of the Night, which is all about Sidney Poitier, a black detective coming into town and getting accused of a crime and then having to clear himself and then solve the murder. And there's the famous slap heard around the world, as they describe, when Mr. Tibbs slaps the racist white guy. So he does that, and then he gets Oscar nominated for that. He meets one of his idols, or somebody he identifies with RFK, who also was big on healing the divide and removing the concept of othering. Like he throughout his whole career, he's been exploring the concept of otherness, and that is what made him a good director. Because Jerome Robbins came into this project, as we heard about in the other documentary, where he pushed his team of Bach and Harnick to distill the piece down into its universal concept of tradition, which is because Jerome Robbins understood it has to be about something bigger in order to connect with the wider audience, so we don't just shoot our load with just the Jewish community. It has to come to something bigger. And by having someone who clearly identifies with the Jewish religion, but isn't Jewish, but understands the concept of othering, and he's also an Oscar-nominated director and a Best Picture director winner with In the Heat of the Night. So he clearly understands the concept of outsideness, otherness. That's what made him the good choice for this, is because he brought a universal view of understanding what does it mean to be other. Because he does a very good job of, while you don't hate the Russian characters or the constable, you certainly can feel and understand some of the problem or some of the push and pull they face. Like the fact he added in a scene with the constable where his higher up comes to town and says, I noticed there's not many demonstrations in this area. It's quite peaceful here. Do we need to send somebody else in to do your job for you? And that's really the catalyst for why the constable does what he does and why he really is kind of put it. And the fact there's a close-up of him at the end when he's watching everybody leave the town and there's pain in that man's face. He's not gleefully twirling his big Russian mustache,
which he has.
He does have. It's a beautiful mustache. But he took a character of the constable who's really kind of an overlooked side character because he doesn't really have a song. He kind of appears and disappears. But the fact he's referenced throughout the piece as someone who is, once again, he's kind of like Jewison, where he's on the outside looking in to this community in this circle,
but not posing an active threat to it.
Yes,
well,
correct.
The constable
yes.
is Jewison, is what I'm saying. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. But it's that whole thing of you wouldn't get that perspective of finding the otherness in every character of that piece. Fieka is othered in his story. He chooses to leave town with Hava to go to Krakow, which, as we know, is a doom for them later on. But the fact that like they choose to leave, which makes you sympathize with Fieka, and the fact that there's the scene where his friends are taunting Hava on the road, and he's the one that puts a stop to it and says, "That's enough. Go home. We're done with this." So it's once again, it's showing the otherness in these characters who normally would just be played as the generic villain of the story. And like that's important. And I think that's more what the producer was trying. Maybe he was trying to get at when he said, "I don't want a Second Avenue Yiddish production."
No,
Where
I get what he's saying. I don't want to
yeah,
like say that. Oh, how dare he insult Yiddish
yeah.
productions? Like
Mhm.
I'm just saying like
I think what they were going for was we want a universality and someone who will understand the concept of otherness that is explored in this piece. Because otherness is besides tradition, is the other big thing, which is why you can, like, as they show in this other documentary, it's done in inner city schools with Puerto Rican and Black children. It's done in Japan. It's done all over. It's done all over the world because everybody understands tradition and otherness. There's always a group on the outside, or a group being persecuted, and that is what Norman Jewison's perspective. I mean, he took somebody like Cher, for example, and won her an Oscar for Moonstruck.
yeah.
Cher, by all accounts, was considered an other in Hollywood because she was a singer. She did she worked with Sonny Bono. Nobody considered her an actual Oscar caliber actress. She was the other in the arts community, in that film community. But he took her into his film and won her an Oscar for it. So like that's his gift. That is his empathetic ability. Is he can come into any situation and go. Because I mean, even in the heat of the night, there are white characters in that who, while like Mr. Tibbs's partner is at the beginning of the film racist and looks down upon Sidney Poitier, but by the end he's going, "I need your help to solve this case. I can't do it. I'm not smart enough to get this case solved on my own. And it's an important case for us to solve. I need your help." And he understands what that othering does to that detective. So like that's what Norman Jewison does so well, and that's why he is a good director for this piece, and that's why they went to him. I'm not in the room. I didn't hear their meetings about who we're going to get to direct this, but I feel I've been coming out of In the Heat of the Night, them going, okay, this guy clearly understands the power of otherness as a whole.
Right.
And he was able to depict that in such a beautiful way throughout the entire film. I mean, even in the bar scene when Tevye and the Russian bump into each other, there's otherness in that. There's others. There's a fear of looking at them, going, "What are we going to do? I don't know you. You don't know me. What are we going to do?" There's something there that he was able to pull out that maybe another director from another perspective wouldn't have picked up on. So yeah, that's why I think Norman Jewison is the proper choice for this. End of rant.
Well, it's sorry, you raised a lot of interesting points. I kind of want to latch on to some of them, and I like something that you were saying actually specifically about Chava and Fiedka and this idea of otherness and their relationship. And this is actually a note that I wrote down for myself even before watching the documentary, just when I saw this list of questions you sent me. And I'm like, well, my answer to does the director need to be Jewish is kind of my same answer to, well, does Chava need to marry a Jew? And it's no. This is a story about the limits of traditionalism, of that insularity of looking only within your own community. So I really didn't feel like, even before watching it and seeing, okay, just like what a case they're making for why Jewison was the ideal candidate. But I'm like, I will never look at Chava and say, oh, she's making a big mistake by marrying that Russian boy. Like, and we kind of talked about this at length in our previous episodes, so we don't need to belabor it here. But yeah, I think that idea of the otherness within the story, and that's probably why I singled one of those moments out as possibly replacing this introductory sequence, is that it does speak to that same idea, and that I think as an audience, I would like to think we're supposed to sympathize with and identify with Chava, not Tevye, in that kind of moment.
Oh, absolutely. Your heart breaks for Tevye in that moment, because you're willing this man who's already broken so much from tradition to change his way. I mean, we're not going to relitigate that argument, that discussion, but it's the whole thing of, but even in that, Norman Jew, in it would have been really easy for someone to make Tevye the bad guy in that scene, to make him really tyrannical and really just a mean brute of a man. But yet him and Topol work together. I mean, it's actually, I'm pretty sure it's this scene, or maybe because he's wearing that outfit, I think. But it's that thing of they're able to find the othering on both sides of this, because Tevye feels othered by Chava's choice. because now in the village he has a daughter who is dead to him, which puts a mark on you that like in a community where it's all about raising your family and keeping everybody together. What did you do wrong, Tevye and Golda, that one of your daughters has strayed from our flock to go marry an enemy of us? What did you do wrong? So like the fact that he understood the bigger ramifications of that choice that Hava makes, and the othering, and the fact that as we said, he adds in the scene of Golda going to the church, which wasn't necessary. She could have just showed up on the road running after Tevye saying, Tevye, I went and saw a priest and he told me they were married. Like, you didn't have to show Golda going into the church.
Right.
But the fact that they did repeatedly shows the concept of othering, that throughout this piece, it's all about the conflict of us versus them. We are othering. Where are we finding the middle ground? Like, you would think in any given case, a mother going to a church for a daughter would be a happy thing of, oh, marriage, good. But that scene is played so ominously with the really weird lens tilted close-ups of all the paintings on the wall with the eyes staring down at Golda. The music is ominous. It's played almost like a horror movie. It's played as a very dark, scary scene. It's not played joyfully, but they're capturing the otherness of feeling in that space of that. But then also Norman Jewison also had deep appreciation. I mean, you saw the production value and his research that he put into that. Like, there's the picture book that they find, right? That has all the pictures of the Shtetl. And the fact that we'll get into this more about production, but it's the fact that he had such deep respect that even in the other documentary, Topol talks about how well researched Norman Jewison came into this project. That he didn't just rely on his concept of understanding otherness. He went, no, we will get the Jewish elements of the story just right. We will not skimp on that for the sake of generalities. You will still see the Jewish people depicted properly in this, but we will get a bigger thematic thing woven into this piece too. So, he absolutely was the right person at the right time to do this particular film.
And he's also, sorry, one last point about Jewison, and then we can move on, but he's also just like adorable. I feel like that is.
Well, they talk about him becoming a teenage girl, right?
Well, yeah, and like
scenes with the daughters.
There was one moment in this documentary when I like had to pause it because I was laughing so hard, where they were talking about wanting to get Isaac Stern to write and play the violin music for it, and he kind of in like the present day interviews, Jewison was recapping the conversation he had with the producers, and like I wrote it down verbatim because it was like so funny. He's like, the producers are like, you can't hire Isaac Stern, it's going to cost too much money, and Jewison says, what are you talking about? He's the best violinist in the world. He's a Russian Jew. I'm telling you, it'll mean something to, like, just the way he was like so frustrated decades later recounting this conversation. Like he's just really cute. He's a cute little old man now, but he was like, but I'm sure like that was a thing. Like he's very charming. Yeah. He also kind of talked about these interesting anecdotes of screening the film for Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion and meeting them. And he's just this kind of interesting guy who seems really nice, down to earth, and, you know, has the progressive bona fides to really do the story justice. So
it's too bad he never won Best Director.
Yeah, but got his honorary Oscar in 1999.
He got the honorary one. Which,
not bad for a goy, as he says.
Not bad for a goy.
Roll credits.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the next question, though, because it'll tie back into this previous conversation, which is, in the documentary, it is mentioned that Michelle Marsh, who played Huddle, the middle daughter, was the only daughter in the main trio of daughters to not be Jewish. Does being an actor versus a director alter your response to the previous question? Should religious heritage be a factor when it comes to casting decisions? Ryan, give me the lowdown on this one.
Like, my answer is still no for all the same reasons, but I can understand why there might seem to be a little, not necessarily more at stake, but different things at stake when it's the people on stage or on camera. Because I go back, Max, if you're watching this, hi. Our friend Max Ackerman, who's been on a number of our episodes.
It's great.
Yeah, and we mentioned him in our last Fiddler episode too. I guess we should probably get him on one of these Fiddler ones at one point so he can actually speak for himself.
Yes.
But when we did our panel on Paula Vogel's Indecent, he had like a lot of very strong thoughts about non-Jewish actors playing Jewish roles, and that was a plot point in Indecent for those who aren't familiar with it. He brought up Tevye as an example, that he really doesn't like when people like Scott Wentworth play Tevye at the Stratford Festival, and a term that he used at the time was Jewface, and I think that's interesting because I wonder, because Judaism is interesting here, like as this thing that are Jews or are Jews not white, like is a question, like, and like I'm Jewish, I consider myself white. I've never experienced any kind of like racialized experiences because you're Jewish, therefore you're not white. But I understand if you're talking to a Nazi or a Klansman that they would have a very different view on this.
True.
Because when you use a term like Jewface, you are evoking the specters of blackface, yellowface, and we very easily understand why that's not okay, or at least most of us do, I hope.
I hope.
But is the thing that's not okay about them the use of paint, I guess, is because that's a different factor. When you do Jewface, you don't have to apply this like layer of makeup to create a caricature or to inform your caricature, but that doesn't make it necessarily not a caricature. And like we could ask, for example, when you did your whole Tevye spiel at the beginning of our last episode, was that Jewface? And I don't know. I don't have strong enough opinions about this kind of thing because to me it doesn't really feel like at this particular historical juncture, I don't feel like it's a real important site of marginalization, I guess, the way that something like blackface would be. But it is worth unpacking. But at the end of the day, just speaking for only myself, it doesn't bother me that Huddle is that Michelle Marsh playing Huddle is played by this non-Jewish actress. She still did a great job, and they talk, like all of the daughters interviewed in this documentary, they talk about their method acting experience, that they really did immerse themselves into it to the point where they did let their armpits grow. But yeah, like I think like method acting, I know it has a bad rap for very good reasons, but there is something to be said about when it also depends on which school, because method can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but specifically like in the Lee Strasberg tradition, that it is very much about just identifying with the character, understanding how their situation might relate to yours, and forming that connection. So I think somebody who's willing to go through that type of empathetic exercise, like I don't have a problem with them doing that if they're actually going to the trouble to understanding why caricatures can be harmful and often are harmful, is because they don't try to develop or foster that sort of identification, that they see just these grotesque outside signifiers of what it means to belong to this culture and play that in a derogatory manner. And I don't think that, I've seen the film many times, I cannot say that Michelle Marsh's performance does that, which is why I don't really have a problem with it. I would almost think it would be maybe more interesting if Chava of the three daughters was the one played by a non-Jewish actor, because that could maybe subtextually be implying, well, she's the one to marry outside of the faith because the non-Jewish actress shouldn't be with a Jewish man. Could you imagine? Like I get that there's some more, I guess, phenomenological baggage to that I don't really think anyone would read much into it other than myself, and I don't really hold it to that kind of standard either. But yeah, Huddle is fine. I think she did a great job, and I don't hold her religious upbringing against her. Yeah, long way of saying that.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I mean, there's the selfish answer, which is I want to play Tevye, so cast me. But my other thing is, no, religious heritage I don't think should be a factor in your casting decisions. It's different from ethnicity, where ethnicity for me is racially based, where it's like no white woman should ever play Motormouth Maybelle in Hairspray. That is a BIPOC woman's role. Same thing with Miss Saigon. No no white actress to ever play the role of Kim or the engineer. With this, it's more along the lines of, if you do cast someone who is not Jewish in the role, I would expect that actor or performer to go home and do quite a bit of research. Go to your local synagogue. Go to your go on your documentary hunt and go and find your information and really research and come in like Norman Jewison did, knowing more about Judaism than Topol did, as Topol has said in interviews. Like, that's what I expect. And Michelle Marsh seems to have done the same thing, where she came into this film, she uncomfortable with the fact that she was the only non-Jewish actress. But to be honest, up until this point, until this documentary, I never picked her off as being non-Jewish. For me, she blended right in with her sisters, and she gives a heartbreaking performance of "Far from the Home I Love." I never would have, like, unless they had said it in the documentary, I still to this day would have been, oh yeah, she's an actress, she played the role, I assumed she was Jewish. But that's the power of acting. Acting is about play, and it's about performance. It's about being able to step into any type of shoe within reason, and you play the part, meaning you come in, you do research, you play the part authentically. You don't pull a Alec Guinness where he played Fagin in I think in the 1940s version of Oliver Twist, and he did a very anti-Semitic, big nose, over the top. Like, that's where I go, okay, that's down to direction and makeup, where they're choosing to be really crude and awful, which I think is a bad version of what you call it, Jewface.
Yeah, well, just using the term that Max used, but yes.
Yes, correct. Which is, yeah, because for me, I go, that for me is Jewface, where it's particularly being anti-Semitic, it's over exaggerating those, it's going into caricature. So I mean, if I were to play Topol, I definitely would not do the voice I did in the last opening. I would absolutely find my own way into the role. I would absolutely go and do my proper research. So if I were to come in and play Tevye, I would have a good understanding, be able to say the prayers properly, and not bumble and caricature my way through it. Like, I watch some of these high school productions of Fiddler, and it's very clear that some of them are doing what they deem as what they feel is a Jewish kind of action, or the voice they do, to like that Yiddishy kind of way of doing it. Like, it's very important that if you're going to take on a role that you're not overly familiar with the culture and heritage of it, that you go away and do your due diligence and research. And that goes for any role that you take on. If you're playing a real person or somebody of a different culture, then go in and do your properly done research. Like, if I was to go play Victor Hugo in a biopic about Victor Hugo, I would absolutely go and research French history. I would go in and understand the world that he was coming from, the world he was living in, so you could properly understand the character. I go to a proper dialect coach, so I wouldn't just be doing the fake French, Lumiere accent. Like, you do the proper work to play the character. And Michelle Marsh showed that's what you do. Say it. So did Norman Jewison coming into this film. He did the proper research, and it shows. If they just come in and done stereotype stuff, then that wouldn't have worked. Like Yent is a character that you have to get right. If not, it could become very stereotypical. So so they cast Molly Pecan to do the part, and she is Jewish, and she knew how to do that character. Now, if they cast somebody who was non-Jewish and they did that type of stereotype, then you're getting on the line of, okay, we're going into a bit of a dangerous area here. So you got to, once again, it comes down to me of, if you can play the part within reason. So once again, ethnicity is different. But if you're going to play the part, then you do. Then it's your job to do due diligence and research, so you come in as best prepared as you possibly can, and you don't rely on stereotypes to fill in the gaps. If that makes sense.
It does. I have a lot of thoughts. I guess
boy.
About unpacking your Well, first of all, I don't know if we can entirely say that we're talking, when we talk about Judaism, that it is just religion and not ethnicity. True. Because there is an ethnic dimension to Judaism.
There is. I mean, Rosalind Harris talks about her nose.
Yeah.
And her being self-conscious of it until Barbara Streisand came along.
And I think the kind of the Jews in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russia and Ukraine, they were not considered Russians or Poles by
True.
the Russians and Poles, their community, that
Right.
there is this kind of inherited baggage that
Yes.
does come. And I can understand an argument that there is, that as a result of that, there is not necessarily no difference, but not as much difference as you'd think between something like that and a white actor playing a black role.
Yes.
I still don't think that that's entirely called for, but I guess a follow-up question that I might have for you, because I'm Jewish,
Yep.
ethnically speaking.
Yep.
If I don't believe I outwardly present as what we might understand as stereotypically Jewish affectation, but if I were to play model in a production, I hope not, because I'm not an actor. So something
you'd be a great model. I can see
something must have gone horribly wrong for me to find myself on stage playing model. And I play up those potentially stereotypical affectations. If I, despite being Jewish myself, were to put on a kind of Jewface to heighten that element, because I'm like, well, it's Fiddler, it's old country, this is how I have to behave. If I were to do that, does the fact that I am Jewish make it okay, or are stereotypes categorically bad regardless of who does them?
Oh, well, that's
you don't have to have an answer to it necessarily now. I've thrown a big question at you, but I think because that we're coming up against something very interesting here. Does the identity,
it could be a roundtable discussion, right?
It could be, and perhaps maybe one day we will do that. But yeah, I think the question is, does the identity of the performer's synchronicity with the identity, the kind of ethnic identity, so to speak, of the role negate the possibility of portraying it in a harmfully stereotypical manner?
I would go with, for me, I would just do, if you are a Jewish actor, you come from the Jewish faith and you come into the role of model and you've made this acting choice and the director okays it and the director understands and there's a dialogue there and like, I would go, I trust the performer as someone who has grown up within the faith in question to play that part the way they feel is appropriate, because you would understand the line of where does it go too far and become really bad, and where is it up to the line of, okay, we're just heightening something for the sake of a character, right? Like I'm trying to think of something in the Catholic religion, but I can't think of anything right now. I mean,
not
very
Catholic,
boring and bland in that sense.
But like an example that comes to my mind, I suppose, is, I forget his name, but the indigenous actor who played the role of Pocahontas's father in Disney's Pocahontas.
Right.
Yes. Like he was himself indigenous. He's a controversial figure within indigenous rights activism, and he very firmly, made the argument that this is the best film that we could possibly get for our community, which a lot of people in his community disagreed with, rightly so in my opinion. But does him playing the role in that way, committing to it the way he does in a very fetishistic, Disneyfied interpretation of it, does the fact that, well, he's indigenous and he endorsed it by being in it and being so supportive of it, does that, should we accept his credentials as being in the community as, getting the pass on that? And maybe you and I are not in the position to be judge and jury on something like that, because we don't belong to that community ourselves. But I would not blame other indigenous folk for taking issue with his stance and not like giving him carte blanche just because he does belong to that community.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to, he's part of that community, so clearly he has some bigger understanding than we ever would about things. Clearly he has a certain belief at a certain point of view. It's kind of like within the community, like if you did do model and you played it up really big and it became caricature and offensive to some, you may have to answer for that within your community. However, I would go, as someone who is not Jewish, who has done my own research and has done my own thing with my own track, but you've done your journey and your research, this how you feel it should be played. I defer back to you and go, this is your opinion, this is the way you want to be portraying this role. Ergo, I trust your judgment in playing this part. Same thing with this actor, forget his name, who played Powhatan. Or no,
Powhatan. Yeah, I think.
Powhatan, I think is the character name. Like, he came in, apparently he consulted on language. So they used proper language for Pocahontas' tribe, apparently. Apparently he was a big consultant with them about things like that. So clearly he had some influence and base. Like, it wasn't just, come on in. I mean, the problem comes when Jim Cummings, a white guy, does your singing voice. That maybe there's a little bit of problems there.
Sure.
But the fact that he was consulted, he clearly felt he was consulted, he felt heard, and he felt strong enough with the project that at the time in the 90s, now maybe his opinion has changed decades later, but in the 90s, when you had things like Dancing with Wolves and in going back into the history of indigenous performers in film, like Rita Moreno, who's Puerto Rican, playing Island Girls and things like that, and other indigenous women in very offensive costumes playing roles. Maybe he felt at that time in the mid 90s, he goes, they consulted, they used our language properly. They're not depicting us as savage villains of the story. We are people with our own brains, our own minds, our own character development. Like, his character has a big journey in that film where he comes in saying the white people are dangerous, we don't want to touch them, and then he almost executes John Smith, and at the end he chooses peace at the end. Historical accuracy is a different story, but for his character's journey, that is a big journey for someone to be on, and it's not a two-dimensional character. It is someone who goes through a bigger story. So maybe that's why he felt justified in saying, this is a good story. It paints us in a decent light. We're not we're in his opinion, we're not stereotypical as compared to like the 50s version of like indigenous characters, where like you have the Paint the Man Red, I think it's called, or whatever that indigenous song Peter Pan is, which is really offensive. Like, that's it. Like, Pocahontas to Peter Pan, like,
still has a lot of problems, but
there's a huge step up in proper representation and drawing and whatever. So I mean, once again, I would defer back to the person of that community going, you're playing this role, you're coming in with already a built-in experiences, and you've also, I hope, have done research, and this is your choice. Now, you will have to justify that choice to whoever, just as I would have to justify my choices as an actor to whatever. Like, if I played a Catholic priest and I play them as kind of creepy, kind of like Philip Seymour Hoffman does in Doubt, and somebody from the Catholic Church comes up and talks to me about it, I'm going to have to answer questions. I'm going to have to be willing to have a conversation, because once again, this type of topic brings up a lot of personal opinion, and I think that's the biggest thing here. Is this is our personal opinions on this subject. You walk down the street, you walk into your local synagogue, you may get an entirely different perspective of opinions, right? This is a big conversation that we're just skimming the surface of. I think it's the nicest way to say.
I suppose that's as good a point of any to cap this on. I know the next question we have will also bring a new wrinkle into this discussion.
It does.
So maybe this is the time for that.
It does. So, Kenneth Turin, the Yiddish film critic featured in this documentary, gives his opinion that he didn't feel Topol was the right for the lead role of Tevye. Do you agree with his opinion? Ryan?
Yeah, like this. I actually want to hear your answer first before I get into mine. Because, like, we started talking about this while we were planning the questions.
True.
And, well, actually, before you get in yours, I can, because I wrote down the exact quote in the film where he explains his reasoning.
Yes, read the quote.
So Kenneth Turin, and I quote, "Tevye is really a quintessential Eastern European Jew. Topol is many things, but no one would ever confuse him with an Eastern European Jew. That didn't work for me. That was a sticking point for me. I mean, Israeli Jews have a different physicality, a different relationship with the world. They wouldn't take any guff from anybody," end quote. I'd like to hear your thoughts first.
Okay. So when he said this quote, I was kind of shocked, because for me, I always felt everybody agrees Topol is Tevye. Like, that is his role. Like, everybody, like, he's critically acclaimed for it. Like Yul Brynner as the King in The King and I. Like, this is a role that people paid him years to play. Like, he's played it from before the film all the way up to basically 2009, 2010. Like, this was a big role for him. Everybody seemed to like him in the part. And then to have somebody go, I didn't really like him in that. I didn't feel he was right. I kind of go, huh. So for me, I go, Topol will always be the quintessential Tevye for me. as my dad says, he has the right voice, the right mannerisms for someone. He goes, I believe that he is an aged milkman of 5 daughters. I believe he has a believability to him. There is a relation that you understand about him. Now, whether or not he is, I wouldn't say maybe from looking at pictures of people from Eastern Europe who lived in these shows. He definitely doesn't have physically. He may not look the part. There are differences in that, but I mean, overall, I mean, I would definitely say I thoroughly enjoyed his performance as Tevye. I think it's a beautiful layered performance. I am angry that he won the Oscar for this performance. It is Oscar worthy, absolutely. For me, I understand in the sense of, I mean, he talks very fondly about Zero Mostel playing this role, and Zero Mostel is a very different Topol or Tevye. Sorry, he has a very different Tevye compared to. He's a very different Topol, but once again, like you hear about, and they talk about this in their documentary of a New York Jew would look up at God in a situation and go, why? Pleading, versus a Israeli Jew would look up at the God and go, why? It's anger. I'm not taking shit from anybody anymore. I'm fighting back. Right? Like Topol's big line is, this is still my home. Get off of my land. Right? They talk about that line in the other documentary and how he says it, how there's an authority to it that maybe somebody from a Jewish person from a different part of the world maybe wouldn't have said it like that. Maybe they're a little more put upon. But for the film, it works. There once again, there is a universality to this particular Jewish performance that maybe is missing. That maybe this critic felt was missing. That wasn't specific enough. That maybe was too universal. Norman Jewison in erring on the side of believability, and because that was Norman Jewison's big thing was, I need to believe this guy could pull a dairy cart and be a conflicted man in this town. And he says Zero Mostel was too shticky. He was too theatrical to play the part on film. And I agree. You look at, I mean, I read about stories about that, and the fact that there's a story of Zero Mostel doing If I Were a Rich Man, and one of the gags in that is at the end of the song, or during the song, he has an open jug of milk, and his hand slips in and he falls in and he has to shake it off, right? And yet that they say about how throughout his run, that shtick got longer and longer to the point where he had a rag and he would wring the rag out. Like Zero Mostel was big. He worked for the stage.
Yeah.
He worked for that. He was shticky, and he was Zero Mostel and Fiddler on the Roof. Norman Jewison wanted someone to disappear into the role. Topol and Tevye are interchangeable. I see Topol and all I think about is Tevye. I see Rita Moreno, I think Anita and West Side Story. There are characters that you play that you just claim and you identify, and it's the first image you think of with this. It's the same thing, and that's what I think Norman Jewison was going for. He didn't want Emma Watson playing Belle because that is a name. He didn't want a name. He wanted someone who could just seamlessly blend into this world he was creating. And Topol does a beautiful job of that. When he walks around that barn, it feels familiar. He knows he can step up off the ladder 2 steps early and make it to that landing in time. He knows what boards to step on as he's walking around that barn. He knows that just the little things he does that show that he understands the world. And I think that was the important thing. Was Topol became a big actor after this, but at the time when they brought him in, he wasn't a big film actor. He was a guy in London from Israel who came to London not knowing the English version of the songs. Like, he was an actor of the stage, but he was able to be brought into the film and he blended in perfectly. So
I'm also struggling to think of another movie that I've seen Topol in. Which
he was in For Your Eyes Only with Bond.
Oh, I don't even think I saw that one.
It's a good one.
I don't recall a Bond movie with Topol in it, but because it's interesting when you say like, oh yeah, he is synonymous with this role, because like I'm like, have I seen any other movie with him, or is he just Topol equals Tevye for me? Because Zero Mostel, I agree, he was like, I love him to bits. I think he is a wonderful performer. I actually just earlier this week rewatched the Waiting for Godot made for TV version that he did with Burgess Meredith, because I was teaching that in the class that I TA for. I did a lecture on. And yeah, that's my favorite version of Waiting for Godot, with him, Zero Mostel as Estragon, and that's who he is. That's him in his element, as like a clownish vaudeville type performer.
He was in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. He played
I know, I love him in that too. Yeah, and that is definitely him in his element. So I would agree that he would definitely draw attention more to the comedy, which Topol does too, but in a very different way.
Well, Topol understands the comedy in the sense of he talks about killing the joke, right? About the bird and the fish, which I'm sure Zero Mostel played up on stage, because it is a funny line if you play it funny. But if you don't, it can be a really scary line, because it's the warning to Hava of, don't step outside the line here. I'm being lenient with you. I'm being a little jokey, but I'm not playing a big game here. And that's what Topol brought to that moment, right? He understood where that line of comedy was and where he could really hone in on the seriousness of the moment.
So,
but back to the original question with
you want to know what I think as a Jew of Eastern European descent about, does this Israeli actor bring that authenticity to that role, like you just take for granted that he does. So to kind of turn it back on our friend Kenneth Turin here, I cannot take away from him his point that, in part of that quote that I made a point of getting down here, is that didn't work for me. That was a sticking point for me. And I can never tell him that it shouldn't be. Or
he saw Zero Mostel play Tevye, which will have an impact. Colm Wilkinson will always be my Valjean, just as Topol will always be my Tevye. He's the first person. He is the version I see in my head. And clearly this critic has ingrained Tevye or Zero Mostel's performance, and clearly that is a bar that was set for him.
And like, I think it's interesting because the reason why they didn't cast Zero in the film is because he seemed too American, or that was one of the cited reasons. So like, if the argument is that, Topol's a lot of things, but Israeli Jews aren't like Eastern European Jews, while American Jews also aren't like Eastern European Jews. So I don't even know if necessarily he would probably, Kenneth Turin would probably have preferred Zero Mostel, but I don't know if he would probably have a similar critique just from the American side. And keep in mind, and this, I learned something very interesting from this documentary, is that Frank Sinatra auditioned for the role of Tevye, which I did not know. And could you imagine the version of this film
it'd be horrible,
with old Mickey Blue Eyes playing?
Horrible. Well, he you read about the way he treated directors on sets, like Ocean's 11, where he refused to do anything except for one take because he was off gambling and drinking.
Yeah,
I can't imagine him working well with Norman Jewison, who would work a scene and figure out the movement and the music and how it all worked together. He'd be like, no. Once again, and also it's Frank Sinatra being like, he would pull the focus.
Talking about someone who like you can't see as a character because he's just himself. Like if Frank Sinatra had been cast as Tevye, the film Fiddler on a Roof would have just been a footnote in Frank Sinatra's career. It wouldn't have been this cultural touchstone that it is today.
Exactly.
But so, I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind here. But to the crux of the argument, I don't agree, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, but I don't agree with Kenneth Turin that, quote, no one would ever confuse him, Topol, with an Eastern European Jew, end quote, because you quite literally just said that you did. And like,
I didn't know otherwise.
I'm not holding that against you, because I too, I've never been to Eastern Europe. My family comes from there too, from a Shtetl, probably very similar to Anatevka, but like the branch of my family that is here in Canada, like, or that I actually got to know has been in Canada for several generations now.
Right.
And like, specifically like of that kind of like Russian Ukrainian sort of side, like on my dad's side, my mom's side is a lot more immediately close to Hungarian Jewry, which is quite different. But I personally don't share Kenneth Turin's frame of reference for what is so different about authentic Eastern European Jews that Topol doesn't bring. He talks a lot about this. They don't take any guff from anyone, this physicality, the relationship with the world. And maybe this is kind of, I don't know, in Holocaust studies, we talk a lot about the post-survivor era that we're now entering, that there aren't a lot of people left who actually lived through it, who have remembered it. So it's up to the later generations to kind of keep this memory alive. And the kind of interesting thing here is we're definitely in this post-survivor era of the Shtetl Jewry here.
Yeah.
At least like the kind that's represented in here, that if I, someone who comes from a direct line of that, would also share your recognition of Tevye, Shtetl Jew, Eastern Europe, as this kind of simulacrum of what that looks like, that I'm not really basing this frame of reference on actual people from that actual culture. I'm basing my frame of reference on films and plays like Fiddler on the Roof. And I see Topol and I'm like, well, this isn't a documentary. Fiddler on the Roof is not a documentary, but it's presenting me with this very authentic feeling image. And it's that feeling is what we gravitate towards more so than the actual like accountant's truth, like of like to use a Werner Herzog coinage of like, well, what is actually true versus this kind of spiritual truth that we feel is being radiated from it. I take pause with Turin's critique here, not because he's not fair to have it, but he is applying his own frame of reference as if it is a universal, that nobody could possibly confuse this Israeli man with an Eastern European man. And I get that maybe the spirit of his point is that nobody should confuse this one type of Jew with this other type of Jew, but that's beside the point of whether or not people actually do. And Topol in particular, although he is Israeli and very Israeli in this way, he does come from that culture. He talked about his relationship to his father in this documentary, and who does come from that. So he's pretty close to it, even if he has been very assimilated into Israeli culture and carries himself in that characteristically Israeli way. Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one that really would have never occurred to me if not for this little segment of this documentary.
It's an interesting segment. I never clocked that there would be a opposing opinion to it. It's fascinating to me.
And I guess my kind of capstone, it's the way I answer all of these questions, is I don't have a problem with it. I wouldn't have a problem with a very Americanized interpretation of it. Like, I guess I'm just, again, it comes back to the same point of I'm not necessarily precious of the proper way to depict this type of Judaism or to just Jewish characters in general. I think that, and especially on the stage, is, I know it's one thing different because, well, we will always have different actors stepping into the role. The longevity of a show is dependent on that. Whereas on film, we have this one purified, version crystallized in this film that has to represent it until we get our remake in a couple years, and then we'll have another one.
We'll see.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't like telling people that within reason they can't or shouldn't or aren't suited for a role, and especially in this wonderful performance by a Jewish actor. If we are even going to harp on that point, like I think it's fine.
Yeah,
for me,
I agree.
It works for me, Kenneth Turin. I can respect that it's a sticking point for you.
Come talk to us. We'll happily
get
more about your opinion. I mean, once again, we don't know if that is a edited quote from him. I mean, we know if there's a longer conversation that maybe didn't make it into the final cut of the documentary. Who knows? So, Kenneth, reach out to us. We'll happily talk to you. All right, next question, which is, this documentary went into detail about how Jewison and his production team made great efforts to recreate the lost Shtetls of Eastern Europe. Having seen the effort that was made, does that change your perspective on the film at all?
It doesn't change my perspective. And it kind of, I guess, going back to all of these questions seem to bring us back to authenticity. And like, I think that's an interesting theme that is evoked through this film, the documentary in particular. But it doesn't change my perspective because I already, in this idea of this spiritual authenticity that we were just talking about in the previous question, I felt that like radiation of this looks like a Shtetl, or at least the idea I have of a Shtetl. I didn't need to see the meticulous work that went into creating that to feel that. Yeah. It's good to know that they did that, but if, having never been to a Shtetl myself, that my frame of reference for what does a Shtetl look like comes from films like this, I was never in a position to question it or to argue that, this little detail isn't quite right. They wouldn't have something like that in a Shtetl. So I'm glad to know they did do their homework. But for me personally, it's just like well, that's neat. Good to learn that they did that. But it doesn't make or break anything one way or the other. I think something that I did find kind of interesting was when they talked about the film being filmed in Yugoslavia, and specifically the reason was because there was too much tension at the time between the US and the USSR, so they couldn't film in the actual place where a place like Anatevka might have been. So they struck a deal with Tito, and he was very favorable to, because Brezhnev is a line too far, but sure, let's choose our authoritarians wisely. So I thought that was just like an interesting detail that I learned from this about the reasoning for why it was filmed in Yugoslavia, which I knew that it was, but it's I guess just a fun detail that they included here. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I was having trouble thinking of like a good answer to how I felt about this.
So for me, like, once again, I've never been to a Jewish shtetl, so this film and other films like it give me the best frame of reference for what a turn of a century shtetl would have probably looked like. What I do appreciate this documentary giving all that detail was it showed the attention and care that everybody on this team, whether you were Jewish or not, Norman Jewison made sure that everybody on his team did their utmost best to convey this world authentically. There wasn't a detail he didn't think about. The paintings on the wall of a synagogue. They could have painted anything. They could have written anything in Hebrew, and I guarantee you a majority of the audience, myself included, would have read that on the wall and gone, oh yeah, sure, that's Hebrew. But the fact that he and his team made such a strong effort to authentically capture that world and the details that went into that world, from how did they build a house? Would they use straw? Would they use wooden roofing tiles? How would they build a well? What type of mechanics would they have used? What type of things, like all those little things you do to build this world of Anatevka? Because as we talked about in the previous review, is Anatevka is a character of its own right in this story, that in this film and in this musical, the village, and the fact that like Jerome Robbins made the proscenium arch of the stage covered in little houses with individual lights so they could look like a little community lit up. Like, the town is a character. So in order to make that character authentic, and so you feel the pain when you're seeing it destroyed in the pogrom, or you're seeing everybody leave this town and the life literally bleeding out of this town as people walk away down the road, you have to put in the effort and the authenticity so you feel it. You feel the town. You feel the dirt and the dust. You feel the pain of the rabbi leaving the synagogue at the end of the movie when he's taking the scrolls. That's what they're called, the scroll.
The Torah. Yeah.
The Torah. Thank you. The Torah. When he's taking the Torah out of its protective case and having to load it into a cart, and you see him walking away from this beautiful piece of art that is this wooden synagogue, you feel more, because you go, oh, they put in the effort. It's authentic. They aged the wood just right. It doesn't look like it's made in IKEA. Like the fact that it was revealed in this documentary, but reading books about it, is originally the film studio pitched that Norman Jewison should film the film right here in Canada, out in our prairie province of Saskatchewan, which
I think they said that in the film too, actually. I think
I'm not sure if they did or not. I can't remember, but I know that's a fact. That is something that they talk about in the book anyway. That's about the making of Fiddler. And it's the fact that it's like, yeah, it's a prairie province, open land. You can build anything out there and it will work just fine. It'll look good. But Norman Jewison was like, no, we are going to Eastern Europe. We're going to find a spot. The fact they went into many different villages. It wasn't just the first one off the side of the road they chose. They went into several and they played the soundtrack in their head, in their earpieces, so they could look at the village and go, is it matching the story? Is it matching the music? Is it matching the feel that we want to give? Like, that type of detail shows the effort, and that makes you appreciate a film like this even more. It's like recently watching the set and costumers for West Side Story, the most recent remake with Steven Spielberg. The production designer and the costume designer, you read about the effort they put into making sure the color of the Puerto Rican flag was right. The costumes, making sure it would fit right in 1957, right when they were tearing down this 4-block radius of New York. So the signs are right, the outfits are right, the signage, like all these details go into building a world and making it so it feels real and authentic. Because when you're portraying history, you want the authenticity. Because when it doesn't work, people are going to be very quick to notice that. I mean, people always like to point out it in Braveheart that people are wearing watches. There are cars driving in the background.
Okay, well, those are big glaring ones, but like
those are big glaring, or even simple as the fact that the Scots people are portrayed as wearing nothing but no underwear and kilts and blue paint. And Scots people were like, no, we weren't that like Neanderthalish. We came in with proper like armor and like we weren't these guys from the hills showing up to battle, right? Like the fact that all these details that Norman Jewison put in reflect a greater appreciation that maybe I don't know what Mel Gibson was feeling.
Big difference.
Was feeling when he made Braveheart. I mean, that film was historically inaccurate, but like the fact that like the Scots people have come out of that movie saying, you didn't quite portray us properly there, or our history was just right there. But people accept it because it's a fun movie. It's a movie about freedom. But the fact that the Scots people come out of that going, you didn't portray us right. But people come out of Fiddler on the Roof going, no, I felt I was transported back to a time that is lost because it's been. I mean, the fact that they say there is no more wooden synagogues because they all were burned during World War II. And the fact that you look at what they recreated and you realize, oh my God, somebody burned that down out of hatred, and we lost some of that beautiful art, and that is tragic.
And I think there is an element of fantasy to this because we don't know what these actual wooden synagogues did look like. And again, it goes back to the fact that we look at a film.
Well, there
like
were
this.
pictures that they had, but like few reference pictures. Like you never know what they.
But you have to dig in archives to find those. That's the research that they did here. Yeah. None of us, maybe in the 60s, it was a little different because there were still survivors at the time. But none of us watching the film know what what we're recreating here. We use films like Fiddler to recreate that for us and create that frame of reference. I think of like Kazuo Ishiguro, the novelist, like he in his I think it was from his like Nobel acceptance speech, he talked about how his early novels, which were set in Japan, a country he only lived in for like the first few years of his life before moving to England, that he was writing these novels to not necessarily create an accurate representation of this country that he has very little relationship to, that he was exercising this fantasy version that he has of this homeland in those novels. But it wasn't about doing research and getting everything right. It was about taking the image in his head and putting it on the page as something that could be artistically conceptualized in this way. And I think for most of us, certainly today, but probably also for definitely like the American audiences watching Fiddler, that we gravitate towards this image because it feels authentic. And it's good to know that it is authentic in this way, but if we found out through a documentary like this that it wasn't, and they got all these things wrong, to me, I don't really feel like that would change the way I relate to it.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, I'm sure there's a bit of romanticization, because would a poor dairyman with 5 daughters have a 2-story house in the village? Probably not.
Is it 2 stories, or is the barn 2 stories?
No,
like that's the ladder.
No, the house is 2 stories because the daughters are up on the upper floor. And during Matchmaker, they're looking out the window, and Tevye and Golda have their room off the kitchen. But so I don't know. Like, would they have had something like as like, I don't want to say nice, because I mean it's not like they're living in a mansion. But like, would their house have been built like that? We don't know. And
maybe they would have. Maybe the argument you're making right now is a lot like, I don't know, would these Scotsmen be wearing underwear? I don't think so. And just have a Scotsman tell you, actually, we would. Like,
yeah, exactly. But for me, I just go, overall, that portion of the documentary gave me greater appreciation and showed once again the level of care that Norman Jewison brought in. That would allow people like the Israeli Prime Minister.
David Ben Gurion or Golda Meir? Which
both of them. The fact that they both come out of that feeling moved by the piece, that they're
Right.
seeing a piece of history, and they're not going, well, that's wrong, because I'm sure that they would probably be people who probably know,
Mhm.
considering they had their communities have come from these places. There's probably stuff they've seen or whatever that they would know more than maybe Norman Jewison would. But the fact they come out of that crying and are affected by the piece just shows that there was nothing that was overly distracting. There was nothing that was so fantastical that it was like, well, that would never work. It's like, no, like this all feels authentic. It's creating a world that you really can connect with, and that you feel the pain for when at the end of the story when they all have to leave the village. So
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah. All right. Should we get into the last question, Ryan?
Yeah, I
We've been
guess
at this
let's do
almost
it.
2 hours.
We have.
Okay, so in the past few years, we've seen musical films directed by directors who don't have experience in working with musicals, such as Tom Hooper, who did Les Mis and Cats, Joel Schumacher, who directed Phantom of the Opera, Bill Condon, who directed Dreamgirls and Beauty and the Beast, and Steven Chbosky, who recently just directed Dear Evan Hansen. Does this documentary prove that only directors with an understanding of musicals should be tasked with directing movie musicals? Ryan.
Well, you're the expert in this more so than I am. I'll preface one thing that this might be another one that I want to volley more so to you to say your piece before but I will just say one thing that I thought was really funny. Since it wasn't necessarily explicitly an argument that the film was putting forward, even though they were very meticulous about just showing how much Jewison knew about musicals.
Yeah.
But there was this scene. I'm trying to remember the context in which it came up, but it basically showed Clint Eastwood in the film Paint Your Wagon.
Yes, where he's singing. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're talking about actors who would have who could have been cast in the film.
Right.
They were casting
so like
names.
leading up to this, and maybe Sinatra was going to play Tevye.
Yes.
But I think it's so funny that Clint Eastwood is the example they use here because he directed Jersey Boys. Like he has since become one of these directors.
Yeah, that movie didn't turn out well either. I forgot
yeah, so I
could have put him on there though.
Yeah, I just found that was like an interesting of all the people you could have picked. I thought, there's an interesting undercurrent to this one in particular. Which I actually still haven't seen the film Jersey Boys, so I'm not in a position to comment on.
It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't great either.
Yeah.
It's kind of middle of the road.
Okay, but no, I want to hear, since you're the musical expert, what is your thought on this one?
Oh, I appreciate being called a musical expert. So for me, I go, what this film illustrates more than anything is having an understanding of music and musicality. Absolutely should be an integral part of filming a movie musical because it affects everybody else in the team. John Williams is the one that really brings up the fact that like Norman Jewison understood music, so I could talk to him on a musical beat by beat level and understand what exactly we had to do. Like the fact they talk, the simple act of Topol or Tevye during If I Were a Rich Man climbing up a ladder to get to a second level, or him stepping in a pile of horse dung in his barn at the end of the song. All that is timed with the music, or the fact that when they went into a village, they were pacing out steps to figure out would this work logistically with the music. Like, and Norman Jewison was thinking about that. So he's like, okay, how do I go about articulating this? And I mean, Rob Marshall comes from is a choreographer, and you can see that in Chicago. Everything he does is with the musical lens, like that whole opening affair sequence with Renee Zellweger and her lover, where they're putting their hands on the door and they're in bed sleeping together. All that is timed musically. There are beats of taking off a belt. There are things you think about if you know musicals of, oh, I can't just have him walk up the stairs. If he's off from the music, it's not going to look right. So I got to figure out a way to mesh this together. And I mean, Tom Hooper, God bless you, buddy. But like his concept of singing live on set wasn't a bad idea. It wasn't because I mean, I think it's actually not a bad idea to have actors sing live on set. The issue was because he didn't understand music, he let the actors have free reign on set, meaning they had a personal accompanist in their ear playing. And basically afterwards, the orchestra would have to go back in and try and match the performance, which you watch the documentary of that. The conductor's basically almost in tears because of how much it's like, okay, he speeds up in this part, but then is shorter in this bar. It's like if you as a director don't understand the basics of that's a bad idea, you should rehearse the song and know exactly what version. Maybe you have 3 versions where you pause a little bit more here, you don't pause there. Like maybe you do that, but like the effort that you put in to understand musicality will come off in the end product. Steven Spielberg, with his most recent production of West Side Story, absolutely understood musicality. He understood it. Like you watch that Tonight Quintet, and just the movements that get made, like the fact that when the Jets and the Sharks burst through their doors of their meeting halls as they march toward the Rumble, it's all timed perfectly. So you feel that pow, the door opens and out they come like a rocket. Or Maria and Riff crossing each other in the street without realizing and they're sitting opposite each other. Little things like that you would do because you understand musically how this all connects to each other. You watch the Tonight Quintet versus One Day More, polar opposite big group number songs. Like One Day More, it's all awkwardly cut. You got really weird close-ups of Russell Crowe. The Thenardiers are somehow in the bar, but not really in the bar. Like it doesn't capture the bigger picture. You watch the Tonight Quintet and you feel the journey of all these people going off to the Rumble while also the other people crossing paths with each other in this 4-block radius. Spielberg understood musicality, how to cut and how to make that work. And Norman Jewison's the same way. You watch Fiddler on the Roof. It's not like Tom Hooper where everything is close up, we're going to look up Topol's nostril the whole time. He understood cut wide, cut in. When do I, and they talk about that in this documentary, and they show Judy Garland's clip, right? Because he directed variety shows, Harry Belafonte. When do you cut in close for a big note? When do you pull back and show the world or show the movement? Jerome Robbins and Robert Wise were the same way in the 61 version of West Side Story. When they're filming that opening fight in New York, the prologue, it's all open. You can see the world that's informing this piece. Same thing, Steven Spielberg did the same thing. They understood, go open, go wide, show the footwork, show the dance, show the power. He understood how to capture that movement, because capturing a musical for a film is really hard to do. And they talk about that in this, where it's hard creating something that's musically done on stage and translating it onto film. Because they talk about how in 61 or whatever, there being another film of how to succeed in business without really trying. And they talked about how all those musical numbers were shot very proscenium, very kind of wide, let the actor move across the shot like they're on stage. You watch Tradition or The Wedding Dance. There are some shots that are proscenium, that are wide, but then as you see Norman Jewison, it's like, no, we'll have them cut in front of the camera. We'll have them do things like that to really kind of animate the shot and capture it tight, and you feel it. So I think this is a really good documentary showing what a good musical director understands when they come into a movie musical, which is they understand musicality and how that affects the way films are made and how important that is to the overall thing. Because when you're missing it, if you can really tell, and it's like, ooh, that just doesn't feel right. Like Rob Marshall, who did a really great job in Chicago, also did 9 and Into the Woods. I would say Into the Woods is better than 9. 9 just doesn't feel, it doesn't quite work right. There's something off. He didn't quite understand how to translate that from stage to screen. And you need a director who understands, how am I going to translate this from stage to screen? Steven Spielberg grew up with West Side Story. He grew up with the album. He had been thinking about this film for ages. Like I'll be honest, in my head, the movie musical I would love to direct is Parade, by Jason Robert Brown and Alfred Urey and Hal Prince, all about the lynching of Leo Frank. But anyway, like I know, like I in my head can picture, and I can easily storyboard for you a sequence from that film, because I thought about it and I know, okay, Leo Frank's gonna walk up the stairs into his office during this song. These are the points we have to hit in the song, because he has to come into the office and close his window to shut the people out. We want to be tight on him to feel that claustrophobic tightness. Same thing with If I Were a Rich Man. Like, it's big, it's wide, because Tevye is feeling aspirational, right? He's feeling like he's owning the barn. This is his domain, and he's imagining the world, right? But then you go in and watch Do You Love Me, which is this beautiful duet between Norma Crane as Golda and Topol as Tevye. It's all shot almost handheld, in a mid-range close-up from like chest to head. It's very close and very quiet. It's a totally different performance. It's not big and
Bombastic.
bombastic. Thank you. Like it is on stage. Like Golda on stage, when you listen to the recordings of Golda doing the "Do you what?" Like really big, and then like Norma Crane's is "Do I what?" Like it's subtle, and as a director, you would understand. Oh, I gotta go small. I gotta go. This is a secret conversation. They're almost whispering this song to each other because it's a private moment. It's intimate, and you understand that. But also not being up their freaking nostril like Tom Hooper would have done it, right? So it's that thing there, and understanding how to take something that's mundane and kind of everyday-ish, and you musicalize it. Like you watch that Matchmaker song, and they're hanging laundry, or they're getting dressed for Sabbath. All that is musically done. You watch Dear Evan Hansen. It's a lot of mundane, modern things. Walking through a school hallway, driving in a car, sitting on a couch. If you have someone who's more musical, you would understand, where do I cut? What beat do I cut on to really hit the music and make that transition work? How do I animate a moment of cooking in a kitchen? Tim Burton actually did a pretty good job with Sweeney Todd, I would say. Mm-hmm. He did a pretty good job of understanding musically where to make the cuts in the music in the film so it all flows together and it works well. And he knew how to balance his shots. So I'd say Tim Burton actually did a pretty good job with Sweeney Todd. There's other things I have problems with that film about, but that's a story for a different day. But for me, I go, yes, this documentary does prove that in order to properly adapt a film from stage to screen, don't just hire the big name director or the person who is a hot pick. Look for someone like a Spielberg, like a Norman Jewison, like a Rob Marshall, for the most part, who will come in and go, I understand this piece, I understand the world, I understand how to cut this, who have some predisposition to rhythm and musicality. Because if you don't, you get a Cats or a Phantom of the Opera or a bland remake of Beauty and the Beast.
Okay. I don't know how much more I could possibly add to that.
Try it.
Like, I think Tom Hooper is such an interesting person to me.
He is a decent director. Like King's Speech, I really enjoyed.
King's Speech is fine. It's like
I know people don't like it.
War Spate kind of drama. Like it's not doing anything showy, so that's where he like it does very well.
But Tom Hooper, if you listen to his commentary, he does know how to frame a shot. Like the fact that like Birdie is always just off center frame because he's off center for a majority of the film, while Lionel is center frame. And I mean, even in Les Mis, I'll give him credit. The fact that a lot of Javert's shots are framed with some type of angelic figure or some type of authority image above him the whole time, so it's that imposing presence. I do give him credit. Like when he wants to think about it, he can. He didn't hit the mark all the time.
But, yeah, like I don't know. I think because what I sort of where my mind goes with a question like this, and I get that this isn't what you were saying per se, but it's, should we be bringing in theater directors to do these kinds of musical film adaptations? And it doesn't necessarily.
I don't say that because Spielberg isn't a theater director.
Yeah,
but he's someone who's done musical numbers in other movies, and he has an appreciation and understanding for music. For long, I mean, some of his films have some of the best film scores because he worked with John Williams. But you watch those two together, and they understand how to cut with music. Like you watch Indiana Jones.
Sure. There
is a musicality to that truck sequence where they're chasing the Ark, right? Like just the way the movie and the music move together. Mm-hmm. Like there is a musicality to that. He has that internal rhythm and beat to him that he gets the rhythmic nature that needs to happen to make a shot work. Anyway, back to you.
No, because I wasn't suggesting that that's what you were implying, and like I think I don't believe Edgar Wright has any like theater experience, but I would love to see him direct a musical. Like it's just someone else who has like a great sense of like rhythm and
good rhythm is important. Like Mel Brooks, was almost a professional drummer, and he has really good rhythm. Like anybody who you can talk to about Mel Brooks's drumming says he is really good. And I mean, that shows in his comedy.
Yeah.
Comedy is rhythm. Comedy is timing.
Well, especially physical comedy, which
Yeah.
he excelled at. But...
He does. He really does.
Yeah.
But like that has musicality. Comedy has musicality. A good comedy has musicality. It has a natural rhythm that you feel, that it's set up punchline.
Right. Because, yeah, like I think why I sort of bring up, well, should we be hiring theater directors to do films like that are like musical based? I kind of respect Tom Hooper in a weird way. I don't think his movies are very good, especially not the 2 musicals that he's done. But I kind of admire the audacity that he sort of brings like into it, like or like not that it's like necessarily like earned this like confidence that he has in his vision of these projects, but he is trying to do these like interesting things that are universally hated by everybody who sees them. But like, but I see him as someone who wants to marry the 2 media of film and theater very in like interesting ways. And
that's why you sing live on set, right?
Like, yeah, and that's why
the thing was create the authentic, so the actor has an acting choice on set of how do I sing this? Because when you watch a live performance, there is acting choices. Like sometimes you'll rush as a part of the scores, so you can have an acting moment somewhere, right? Like, absolutely. Like, a good example of someone who is a theater director who didn't do well directing film was Susan Stroman, who did The Producers. She directed the Broadway show The Producers, and then she directed the film version.
Right.
She didn't direct a bad film. She just was very theatrical in her direction. Like, it's a lot of big, wide proscenium shots to capture Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick, and she didn't know how to rein them in to give a film performance versus a theatrical performance. Yeah. And Tom Hooper is really, I mean, I admire him to just come and say, I want to sing live on set. Like, I go, good on you. It's just, he should have gone to his musical director and gone, okay, we're going to sing live on set. What should we really do? Like obviously, don't give you Jacqueline carte blanche to do the opening soliloquy where there's no rhythm. Because melodically, you're setting up the parallels between Javert and Valjean in their twin soliloquies, right? Like, musically, they are identical to each other. And in order to get those rhythmic and melodic touch points, because again, any musical score, music is used as a honing beacon tool to kind of inform the audience. But when you don't sing on rhythm, you're missing entirely what is going on there. So, yeah. Maybe back to you. I keep cutting.
No, it's fine. I'm still trying to chew on my thoughts because, yeah, like I think the close-ups that you like complain about in something like Les Mis, the 2012 Tom Hooper movie, to me, I see that as part of this idea of marrying the theater and the film. Like, we're performing live on set like theater, but we have the full range of cinematic camera angles that we can do with. Now, he doesn't necessarily make as much good use of editing as we could hope because he stays in these very long cuts, like, but it's sort of, there is something interesting about, oh wow, it feels like a stage musical, but I'm up close and personal like a movie, which you don't get when, and like, I admire there's something interesting about trying something like that. Like Cats, as much of a dumpster fire as that film turned out to be, but you can't really do CGI in theater. Like, where I've seen a lot
God.
Well, I know, but
I've seen Cats is that it is human and that it is the lycra spandex, and but something magical about that.
But like, I don't know. I think it's interesting to try because like I've seen a lot of theater that has attempted to do things like motion capture, where you have like projected on the screen, and
you did it at York. Remember Midsummer Night's Dream?
I remember, and I saw another one pretty recently that I won't name, but like,
okay.
But I guess I kind of think there's something compelling about, okay, can you do a story with photorealistic cat fur like this? It looks terrible and it's creepy as all hell.
Release the butthole cut.
Yeah, no, let's not. But yeah, like I don't know. I feel like people love hating on Tom Hooper because of the end product, which I agree is really, really underwhelming at best and disconcerting at worst. But I don't know. I feel like he's this interesting tragic figure to me and the
Yeah,
fact
I
that
mean, like Les Mis is what had promise.
it did, and it was very successful.
I was enthusiastic about that film.
So
it was
I.
nominated for Best Picture. I was rooting for it to win Best Picture over Argo, because I do think there are merits in that film. I mean, what I think tripped him up more than anything was he edited "I Dreamed a Dream," as he said, and he figured out the close up of, oh my goodness, Anne Hathaway can hold the screen for the 3 minutes of that song perfectly. And then he went back and edited the rest of the film. Because, I mean, you watch that opening prologue right up until the Valjean soliloquy, and it's all beautiful, epic shots. Like you come out of the water and you pan down to the prisoners pulling in the ship, and it's all these big, wide, expansive set shots. And Patti LuPone brought up a really good point about why the close-ups were not a great thing. Because she goes, what's missed when you're always in close-up like Tom Hooper chose to be, is you're missing what's informing the song in the world. Like Anne Hathaway earned the right to do a close-up of I Dreamed a Dream because we just watched her get fired. We've seen her sell her hair, her teeth. She's earned, because what more is there to inform you about by that point in the song? Like she's sitting on a bed in a creaky boat. There's not much more that can inform you in this. So that was earned. Like in Fiddler, like there are moments when Norman Jewison chose to go in tight, like the fact that the Havila ballet, that's all done in close up. That is all done with him being in really tight close up, sitting on the cart, because then it fades into his memory as he's watching this ballet sequence, right? And he comes out and Hava's right there, up close, tight. Tom Hooper came in with a good idea. It's just he didn't have the team in place to think about it and edit it properly to go, okay, what are we missing by doing all this in close-up? Like, you're missing the expansive shot. Like the fact that Valjean's soliloquy is sung in a church. The whole thing about Valjean is he's talking to God. He's asking, what do I do? What have I done? Sweet Jesus. What have I done? Become a thief in the night, become a dog on the run. Like, and he's talking about like the influence of God and the guilt of God in that moment is looking down on him. But you don't get that. Meanwhile, when you walk into the church with Golda, Norman Jewison was very smart. He went wide. He made Golda feel small and helpless as all these eyes and these murals are staring down at her. There is a danger in that space. Same thing with West Side Story. Rita Moreno walks into Doc's candy shop with the Jets. Robert Wise starts wide and then very quickly gets right in there tight because all the Jets surround her and you feel that claustrophobic impending doom and danger of she is now surrounded by a bunch of proverbial sharks, and she is the meat that's about to get consumed. You feel the danger. So once again, Tom Hooper, and it's weird because as I said, Tom Hooper does get it. Like he directs other good movies that are not musicals and understands shot composition. It's just he gets to Les Mis and it's like it all went out the window. Like give me the wide barricade, epic shots of the barricade. Capture the fall of the barricade and not herky jerky, shaky cam shit. Like capture because I've shown you the screenplay and you read that scene in the screenplay. It's so elegant where they describe the bodies falling on the broken stairs, strewn, balletic. Like you read the description and it's so poetic and beautiful. And then you watch it and it's what's going on? What's happening? It's just weird the way they do that. So I just go, you have to be in order to understand music and musicality, you should have some type of experience. I mean, Norman Jewison was Harry Belafonte, and they also reveal at UFT. Shout out to UFT. He did musical reviews.
Yeah.
Spielberg had his musical number of Anything Goes and Temple of Doom, not the best Indiana Jones movie, and 1941. So he came in understanding music. Rob Marshall was a Broadway choreographer who is now a film director. He came in kind of knowing what to do. And it's important, I think. Like Tom Hooper came in with a good idea, which is why the film got made, because Cameron Actors couldn't find anybody to come up with an innovative idea of why do I make this movie now? How do I make it unique? Tom Hooper comes in and says, let's sing it live. Brilliant. I agree. Brilliant. He just had a horrible execution of an idea, which like any director, right? You come in with a good idea. I mean, art director when like we did Midsummer at York with computer generated donkey head. On paper and in theory, it's a good idea. When you actually have to execute it, it's a very different story.
Yeah, so I guess my answer just is pretty simple then. Like, I'm glad that they got Jewison, who knew a thing or two about music and rhythm and musicality, and he did a great job, and the film speaks for itself.
Agreed.
I guess this is all I have to say then. I think we can call it here, unless you had more questions you wanted to discuss.
No, I am good. Ryan, can we safely announce that one of these days we'll do a Fiddler off the Roof commentary? Or maybe a roundtable discussion. Are we done with Fiddler, Ryan? Are we ever done?
I don't think we're done. During the Q&A of this documentary, Daniel mentioned that there was a third documentary that perhaps it's a little less specific about the musical itself, but I believe the title, he said it was Shalom Aleichem, Laughing in the Dark. It's specifically
something
about
like that.
Shalom
Aleichem.
Yeah. So I don't know if we can justify, if we're getting far removed from the stage show, reviewing that on Cup of Hemlock Theatre, but maybe one day we'll round out a Fiddler trilogy with that. But I have a feeling you and I will continue talking about Fiddler until the day we both die.
We will. Maybe one day, Ryan, will have to have a production produced by Cup of Hemlock as our first live performance.
We'll talk. Yeah.
Stay tuned, everybody.
No
in
promises.
The meantime, Ryan, give us that classic Ryan Borochovitz send-off.
Hard to find on social media, so just follow Cup of Hemlock instead. COH Theater on all platforms. If you're watching on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. If you're watching on the podcast, do the podcast things. And you don't have to follow little old me. Mac, plug yourself.
Well, I mean, you can follow me at Mackenzie Corner on all social media platforms. If you are going to try and reach out and connect with me there, just message me saying, I'm this person I saw here, because my accounts are private. I will likely let you in. It's just you got to identify yourself first. So I'm not just going to add a random person. But you can follow all my musical antics with Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast, where my co-host Autumn and I break down all types of musicals. We did Fiddler all the way back as our season 2 opener. We are now nearing the end of season 4, on the road to season 5. So you can definitely go back and check out our 2+ hour breakdown of Fiddler on the Roof.
In case you haven't had enough.
Exactly. In case you haven't had enough. Go do that. Why not? Have some fun. Yeah. But other than that, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and keep the Fiddler with you at all times. Have a great rest of your day. L'chaim.